What if your entire identity was sewn into the clothes you wore? What if the color of your veil dictated your entire existence from dawn until dusk, every single day for decades in the Middle Ages? Number 1. The Bridgettine crown veil. The Bridgettine nuns, members of the Order of the Most Holy Savior, founded by Saint Bridget of Sweden in the mid-14th century, wore a habit that truly stood out in the medieval landscape. Their clothing was not just functional, it was a carefully designed expression of their unique spiritual path and communal life. The most distinctive feature of the Bridgettine habit was the crown-like veil, a white linen coif that covered the hair and head, upon which was fastened a separate white linen veil. This veil featured 5 small pieces of red cloth, often round or square, sewn onto it, one at the very top of the head, and 4 others arranged to suggest the 5 wounds of Christ. This was a clear visual marker, making a Bridgettine nun unmistakable. Beyond the unique veil, the Bridgettine habit included a long gray wool tunic. This tunic stretched from the neck down to the feet, usually with long sleeves that reached the wrist. The gray color was a deliberate choice, often associated with humility and penance, distinguishing it from the more common black or white habits of other orders. Over the tunic, the nuns wore a scapular, a long, narrow strip of fabric that hung down the front and back of the habit, also in the same gray wool. The scapular had a specific opening for the head, allowing it to rest flat over the shoulders. Around the waist, a simple leather cincture or belt was worn, often with a rosary attached, its beads typically made of wood or bone. The materials for the Bridgettine habit were chosen for durability and simplicity. The gray wool for the tunic and scapular would have been relatively coarse, spun from local sheep. Wool was practical for the often cold monastic interiors and provided warmth during long hours of prayer and labor. The white linen for the coif and crown veil required more processing. Flax grown in fields would have been harvested, redded, spun into fine threads, and then woven into a smooth white fabric. The red cloth pieces on the crown veil might have been dyed with madder root, providing a deep, lasting crimson hue. Nuns often made their own habits, with lay sisters responsible for the initial processing of raw materials like wool and flax. This self-sufficiency was part of the monastic ideal, ensuring that even their clothing was a product of their own labor. Life in a Bridgettine monastery was highly structured, governed by Saint Bridget's rule, which emphasized devotion to the Passion of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and meticulous observance of the divine office. The habit facilitated this life. The long tunic and scapular allowed for modest movement during choir prayers, where nuns would stand, kneel, and bow multiple times a day. The cincture kept the layers of clothing neat and tidy. The crown veil, while distinctive, was also practical. Kept the hair completely covered, fulfilling common modesty requirements for women of the time, and its structured nature ensured it stayed in place during various activities, from reading in the scriptorium to tending the monastery gardens. The layers of the habit, though simple, provided a consistent uniform that minimized distinctions between individuals and underscored their shared commitment to the monastic life. The first Bridgettine monastery was established at Vadstena, Sweden, in 1370, after St. Bridget's death, by her daughter Catherine of Vadstena. From there, the order expanded, with foundations appearing across Europe, including England, Sion Abbey, Germany, and Italy. At Sion Abbey, founded in 1415 by King Henry V, the Bridgettine habit was a familiar sight for centuries. Records from Sion Abbey describe the details of the nuns' attire, noting the precise construction of the crown veil and the quality of the gray wool used for their tunics. Historians, like F.R. Johnston, have detailed how the specific design of the habit served as a constant reminder of the order's particular spirituality, especially the 5 wounds of Christ, which were central to Bridgettine devotion. The nuns' daily lives, as depicted in medieval illuminated manuscripts and monastic records, show them engaged in writing, studying, manual work, and intense prayer, all while wearing their characteristic gray and white habits. The Bridgettine habit was more than clothing. It was a silent statement of faith, a uniform of devotion, and a visual representation of their unique place within the tapestry of medieval monasticism. It carried the weight of centuries of prayer and the quiet dedication of countless women who sought a life completely given over to the divine. Number 2. The Carthusian habit. Carthusian order, founded by Saint Bruno in the late 11th century, is known for its extreme austerity, silence, and solitary life. For Carthusian nuns, this profound commitment to reclusion was reflected in every aspect of their habit. Unlike many other orders that focused on communal living, the Carthusians emphasized a hermetic existence within the monastery walls. Their habit was designed not for public display or elaborate ceremonies, but for the quiet, solitary life lived within individual cells and common liturgical spaces. Carthusian nuns' habit was predominantly white, a striking contrast to the black commonly seen in older Benedictine foundations. This use of white was not merely aesthetic. It spoke to the order's emphasis on purity and an unblemished devotion. The main components of the Carthusian habit included a long, white wool tunic. This tunic was cut simply, extending from the neck to the ankles, with long, loose sleeves that reached the wrists. The simplicity of the cut meant minimal seams and adornments, focusing solely on functionality and modesty. Over the tunic, a white wool scapular was worn. This was a long, narrow piece of cloth, wider than many, often extending to the knees or lower, that hung down the front and back. The scapular included a hood, which was permanently attached to the scapular itself. This hood could be pulled up to cover the head, particularly during outdoor work, or when moving between cells in the church in colder weather. Around the waist, the nuns wore a simple, unadorned white cincture, typically made of linen or coarse wool. This belt served to gather the voluminous fabric of the tunic and scapular, keeping the habit neat. The Carthusian veil was also white, made of linen. It was a simple piece of fabric that covered the head and sometimes extended over the shoulders, complementing the white of the coif and scapular hood. The coif underneath the veil was also white linen, ensuring that no hair was visible. All elements of the habit were designed for durability and warmth in the often chilly monastic environment. The wool would have been coarse, unbleached, and probably spun and woven within the monastery or by local artisans. The flax for the linen was grown, processed, and spun by the nuns themselves or by lay sisters, a common practice in medieval monasteries that fostered self-sufficiency. The stark white of the habit was achieved through rigorous washing and exposure to sunlight, as chemical bleaching was not yet a common practice. The function of the Carthusian habit was deeply intertwined with the order's unique commitment to solitude and silence. Nuns spent the majority of their day within their individual cells, which were often small, self-contained units, with a bed, a desk, and a small garden plot. The habit allowed for unhindered movement within these confined spaces and for long periods of sitting during prayer and contemplation. When they did gather for communal prayer in the church, the uniform white habit reinforced their collective identity in God, even as their individual lives remained largely solitary. The hood on the scapular could be drawn up during prayer, adding a layer of personal enclosure and helping to block out distractions, fostering deeper focus. This practice reinforced their detachment from the outside world. Carthusian monasteries for women, while less common than those for men, did exist, such as the Charter House of Gosnay in France, founded in the 13th century, or the Charter House of Premonstratensian in Italy. Records from these foundations indicate a strict adherence to the Carthusian rule, which dictated every aspect of their lives, including their clothing. The white habit remained largely unchanged throughout the medieval period, a testament to the order's unwavering commitment to its foundational principles. Chroniclers like Adam of Ensham, though writing about the male Carthusians, describe a life so dedicated to quietude that the habit itself became a silent extension of their vows. The very simplicity of the Carthusian habit, its lack of decoration or distinguishing marks other than its pristine white, was a statement in itself signifying a complete renunciation of worldly vanity and a singular focus on the spiritual journey. It was a habit worn for a life lived largely in isolation, a testament to profound personal devotion, rarely seen by the outside world, yet deeply purposeful within the cloister. Number 3. The Premonstratensian white. The Premonstratensian order, also known as the Norbertines or White Canons and Canonesses, was founded by Saint Norbert of Xanten in the early 12th century. This order adopted a habit that was predominantly white, a deliberate choice that set them apart from the older, established, black-robed monastic orders like the Benedictines. The white habit was intended to signify the purity and innocence associated with the angelic life, as well as a return to the simplicity of the early church. For Premonstratensian canonesses, their habit was a visible symbol of their commitment to both contemplative prayer and pastoral work, particularly in the early centuries of the order, even though the female houses eventually became more enclosed. The main components of the Premonstratensian habit included a long, white wool tunic. This tunic was simply cut, reaching from the neck to the ankles, with long sleeves that extended to the wrists. The white wool, though perhaps not bleached to a dazzling brightness, would have been processed to be as light in color as possible, often through extensive washing and sun-drying. Over the tunic, the canonesses wore a white wool scapular, a long, narrow strip of fabric that hung down the front and back of the habit. The scapular typically had an opening for the head and rested flat over the shoulders. Unlike some orders, the Premonstratensians did not generally have an attached hood on their scapular, relying on a separate veil for head covering. Around the waist, a simple white linen cincture or belt was worn, usually without elaborate knots or decorations. The head covering for Premonstratensian nuns consisted of a white linen coif that completely covered the hair, and over this, a white linen veil. This veil typically draped over the head and shoulders, providing modesty and uniformity. For ceremonial occasions or during colder weather, a white wool mantle or cloak might have been worn over the entire habit, offering additional warmth and a more formal appearance. The materials used for the habit were similar to those of other orders: wool for the main garments and linen for the undergarments and head coverings. The processing of these materials, from shearing sheep to spinning yarn and weaving cloth, would have been a labor-intensive process, often performed by the nuns themselves or by their lay sisters. Consistent use of white underscored the order's desire for a visible distinction from the black monks and black canons. Premonstratensian habit was functional for a life that, especially in its early days, could involve both strict communal prayer and engagement with the local community, depending on the specific foundation. While male canons often served parishes, the female houses became increasingly enclosed over time, though their original spirit often maintained a focus on liturgical splendor and intellectual pursuits. The white habit, being relatively plain in cut, allowed for ease of movement during the numerous daily services in choir, manual labor within the monastery, or study in the scriptorium. The lightness of the habit's color might have been less practical for some forms of manual labor, but it served as a constant visual reminder of their dedication to purity and a life consecrated to God. It made them easily identifiable, especially during periods when Premonstratensian communities might interact more with the lay populace. Notable Premonstratian foundations for women included the Abbey of Lef in Belgium, which housed both canons and canonesses for a period, and numerous smaller priories across Europe. Historical records, such as the Vita Norberti, Life of Norbert, and the order's own statutes describe the desired simplicity and distinctiveness of their habit. These documents emphasize the importance of uniformity and humility in their attire, reflecting their commitment to the Augustinian rule which they followed, adapted for their specific charism. The white habit endured as a symbol of the Premonstratensian commitment to a life of evangelical poverty and purity, a clear and strong visual statement in the medieval world of monastic attire. It spoke of a fresh start, a return to core values, and a distinctive identity in the landscape of religious orders. This habit, though simple in its construction, carried the weight of a powerful spiritual tradition, a tradition that emphasized a clean break from worldly concerns and a luminous dedication to the divine. Number 4. The Carmelite brown. Carmelite order, tracing its origins to hermits living on Mount Carmel in the Holy Land in the 12th century, developed a distinctive habit that reflected their unique spiritual journey. Originally, the hermits wore simple homespun garments. As the order moved to Europe and formalized, their habit evolved, settling on a humble brown and later incorporating a significant white mantle. For Carmelite nuns, particularly those of the primitive rule, their habit was a visible sign of their commitment to contemplation, silence, and prayer, often within strict enclosure. The brown color was chosen for its association with the earth, humility, and the simple lives of the early hermits. Primary components of the Carmelite habit included a long, brown wool tunic. This tunic was cut simply, reaching from the neck to the ankles, with long sleeves that reached the wrists. The brown color would have varied in shade, depending on the natural dyes available and the source of the wool, but it was generally a deep earthy tone. Over the tunic, the nuns wore a brown wool scapular. This was a long, narrow strip of fabric that hung down the front and back of the habit, usually extending below the knees. The scapular had an opening for the head and rested flat over the shoulders. It was typically unadorned, reflecting the order's emphasis on simplicity. Around the waist, a leather cincture or belt was worn, often with a rosary attached. The head covering for Carmelite nuns consisted of a white linen coif that completely covered the hair, and over this, a white linen veil. This veil was a simple, rectangular piece of fabric that draped over the head and shoulders, providing modesty and uniformity. The white of the coif and veil offered a striking contrast to the brown of the tunic and scapular. In some Carmelite traditions, particularly later, in the medieval period and beyond, a white wool mantle or cloak was worn over the entire habit, especially for liturgical functions or during colder weather. This mantle, when worn, made the habit appear predominantly white from a distance, adding to its visual distinctiveness. The materials for the Carmelite habit were practical and readily available. The brown wool for the tunic and scapular would have been robust, providing warmth and durability for daily wear. Linen for the undergarments, coif, and veil was preferred for its smoothness and ease of washing. Nuns often engaged in the preparation of these materials themselves, spinning wool and flax and weaving cloth. The simple construction of the habit, with minimal embellishment, underscored the Carmelite vow of poverty and detachment from worldly possessions. The layers provided warmth, and the complete covering of the body fulfilled the expectations of monastic modesty. Life in a Carmelite monastery for women, such as the convent of St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi in Florence, founded in the 15th century, revolved around profound enclosure and prayer. The habit facilitated this life. The long tunic and scapular allowed for quiet movement during long periods of contemplation, liturgical prayer, and manual work within the cloister, such as weaving, sewing, or preparing herbal remedies. The head covering, particularly the white veil, ensured a sense of anonymity and detachment from the world, allowing the nuns to focus entirely on their spiritual journey. Brown and white color scheme of the habit became deeply associated with the Carmelite identity, recognizable to those familiar with religious orders. Historical accounts, such as those related to the life of Saint Teresa of Avila, though she lived later, describe the daily wearing of the Carmelite habit and its significance. The very act of donning the habit each morning was part of the spiritual discipline. The habit was worn throughout the day and often at night, serving as a continuous reminder of their vows. The simplicity of the habit also meant that it was relatively easy to repair and maintain, an important consideration for a life dedicated to spiritual pursuits rather than material concerns. The Carmelite habit, with its humble brown and contrasting white elements, spoke volumes about an order dedicated to an interior life of prayer, a silent testament to centuries of quiet devotion and unwavering faith within the confines of the cloister. It embodied a philosophy of simplicity and an unshakable commitment to a life of deep contemplation, a visual echo of their desert origins. Number 5. The Poor Clares, simple gray. The Poor Clares, or the Order of Saint Clare, emerged in the early 13th century, founded by Saint Clare of Assisi and Saint Francis of Assisi. This order, inspired by the radical poverty of the Franciscan friars, developed a habit that was profoundly simple, reflecting their commitment to evangelical poverty and a life entirely dependent on divine providence. Their habit was deliberately unadorned, often made from undyed or coarse wool, typically in shades of gray or a very natural brown, emphasizing their humility and detachment from worldly comforts. The core of the Poor Clares habit consisted of a long gray or natural brown wool tunic. This tunic extended from the neck to the feet, usually with long, wide sleeves that reached the wrist. The wool itself was often unbleached and undyed, giving it a rough utilitarian texture and a color that was simply the natural shade of the sheep's fleece. Over the tunic, the nuns wore a scapular, also made of the same coarse gray or brown wool. This was a long, narrow strip of fabric that hung down the front and back of the habit, usually reaching below the knees. The scapular had a simple opening for the head and rested flat over the shoulders. Unlike some other orders, the Poor Clares generally did not wear an elaborate cincture. Instead, a simple rope or cord with 3 knots, symbolizing their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, was tied around the waist. The head covering for the Poor Clares consisted of a white linen coif that completely covered the hair, and over this, a simple unadorned black veil. The black veil, often made of lightweight wool or a coarse linen draped over the head and shoulders, providing modesty and a visual distinction from other orders. Contrast between the dark veil and the lighter gray or brown habit was a visual marker. Some Poor Clares also wore a small crown of thorns or a simple crucifix attached to their cincture or rosary, though this varied by monastery and region. The materials for their habits were chosen for their availability and low cost. Wool, often coarse and unrefined, was practical for durability and warmth. Linen, used for undergarments and coifs, offered a smoother texture against the skin. Many Poor Clare monasteries were self-sufficient, with the nuns themselves spinning yarn, weaving cloth, and sewing their habits, a practice that underscored their commitment to manual labor and poverty. The Poor Clares habit was intrinsically linked to their daily life of strict enclosure, contemplation, and mendicancy, meaning they relied on charity. The simplicity of the habit allowed for ease of movement during their demanding liturgical prayers, which included singing the divine office for many hours each day. It also facilitated their manual labor, such as gardening, baking, or sewing tasks that helped sustain the monastery. The deliberate lack of embellishment on their habit was a constant reminder of their vow of poverty, a cornerstone of their Franciscan spirituality. Their rule dictated that they should live without personal or communal possessions, relying entirely on donations. The habit thus served as a testament to this radical commitment, demonstrating their detachment from all forms of worldly wealth and status. Foundations of Poor Clares spread rapidly across Europe after their establishment in Assisi in 1212. Convents like San Damiano, Their first home, and later ones in Rome, France, and Spain, became centers of intense spiritual devotion and a visible manifestation of radical Franciscan ideals for women. Chroniclers of the period, such as Thomas of Celano, who wrote about St. Francis and St. Clare, consistently emphasized the profound poverty embraced by the poor Clares, a poverty reflected in their simple, unadorned gray or brown habits. The habit was a uniform, not a costume. It removed individual distinctions and promoted a collective identity rooted in shared vows and a common pursuit of holiness. This habit, unassuming in its appearance, powerfully conveyed a life dedicated to humility, prayer, and a profound identification with the suffering of Christ, a choice that echoed the very simplicity of the Gospels. Number 6. The Dominican, black and white. The Dominican order, formerly known as the Order of Preachers, was founded by Saint Dominic de Guzman in the early 13th century. While initially focused on preaching and teaching to combat heresy, the order quickly established communities of nuns known as Dominicinesses, who supported the friars' mission through prayer, penance, and scholarly work within the cloister. The Dominican habit for nuns became one of the most recognizable in the medieval period, famously featuring a stark contrast of black and white, symbolizing purity and penance, and reflecting the order's intellectual rigor and commitment to truth. The main components of the Dominican habit included a long white wool tunic. This tunic extended from the neck to the feet, with long sleeves that reached the wrists. The white wool was chosen to represent purity and innocence, a constant visual reminder of their consecrated life. Over the white tunic, the nuns wore a white wool scapular, a long, narrow strip of fabric that hung down the front and back of the habit, typically extending below the knees. The scapular had a simple opening for the head and rested flat over the shoulders. Around the waist, a leather cincture, or belt, was worn, from which a rosary, typically with a large crucifix, was suspended. The Dominican rosary, with its distinct number of beads, was a hallmark of the order. The most striking feature distinguishing the Dominican habit was the black wool mantle or cloak worn over the white tunic and scapular, especially for liturgical functions, public appearances, or during colder weather. This black mantle was a full-length garment, often with a hood attached, providing warmth and a solemn appearance. The head covering consisted of a white linen coif that completely covered the hair, and over this, a black veil. This black veil was a simple, rectangular piece of fabric that draped over the head and shoulders, providing modesty and a stark contrast to the white elements underneath. The visual impact of the black and white was significant, making Dominicinesses instantly recognizable. The materials for the Dominican habit were chosen for durability and to convey the order's balance of austerity and intellectual dignity. White wool, for the tunic and scapular, needed to be processed to achieve its light color, likely through repeated washing and sun-drying. Black wool for the mantle and veil would have been dyed, perhaps using woad or other natural black dyes available in the medieval period. Linen used for the coif and undergarments provided comfort against the skin. Nuns typically sewed their own habits with the help of lay sisters who might assist in the spinning and weaving processes. The cost of materials was kept moderate, reflecting their vow of poverty. Yet the habit was always clean and well-maintained, befitting an order that valued intellectual pursuits and public witness. The Dominican habit was deeply integrated into the daily life of prayer study and manual labor within the cloister. The long white tunic allowed for easy movement during the long hours spent in choir, chanting the divine office. The black mantle, worn over the white habit, provided warmth and a sense of gravity during solemn liturgical ceremonies and processions. Contrast between black and white was often interpreted as symbolizing the purity of life. White, under the shadow of penance and mortification, black, or alternatively, the light of truth shining through the darkness of worldly error. The rosary, prominently displayed, served as a constant reminder of their devotion to the Virgin Mary and the power of prayer. Dominican convents for women flourished throughout Europe, such as the convent of St. Agnes in Bologna, founded in 1219 by St. Dominic himself, and later major foundation in Paris. Siena, home to St. Catherine of Siena, though she was a lay Dominican. Historical records, including the Liber Constitutionum Fratrum et Sororum Ordini Praedicatorum, Book of Constitutions of the Order of Preachers, laid out the specific requirements for the habit, ensuring uniformity across various convents. Chroniclers often remarked on the distinctive appearance of Dominican nuns, noting the blend of simplicity and solemnity conveyed by their attire. The habit, with its clear black and white distinction, not only identified them to the outside world, but also served as a continuous internal reminder of their vows and their commitment to a life dedicated to God, truth, and scholarly pursuits, a visual sermon in itself. Number 7. The Cistercian unbleached wool. The Cistercian order, founded in 1098 at Citeaux in Burgundy, sought a return to the stricter observance of the Benedictine rule, emphasizing simplicity, austerity, manual labor, and liturgical purity. For Cistercian nuns, their habit reflected this foundational spirit, prioritizing practicality and humility over any form of embellishment or striking color. Unlike the predominantly black habits of the older Benedictine monasteries, the Cistercians opted for a habit that was largely undyed and unbleached, resulting in shades of gray, brown, or off-white, the natural colors of wool. This choice underscored their commitment to poverty and their rejection of worldly ostentation. The core of the Cistercian habit consisted of a long wool tunic, often in an unbleached or naturally colored grayish-white, sometimes even a light brown. This tunic extended from the neck to the ankles, with long, relatively loose sleeves that reached the wrists. The wool would have been coarse, reflecting the order's emphasis on austerity and self-sufficiency. Over the tunic, the nuns wore a scapular, also made of the same natural wool. This was a long, narrow strip of fabric that hung down the front and back, typically reaching to the knees or lower. The scapular had a simple opening for the head and rested flat over the shoulders. Around the waist, a simple linen or coarse wool cincture or belt was worn, without any elaborate knots or decorations. The head covering for Cistercian nuns consisted of a white linen coif that completely covered the hair, and over this, a black veil. This black veil, often made of a light white wool or linen, was a simple rectangular piece of fabric that draped over the head and shoulders, providing modesty and a visual contrast to the lighter habit. For liturgical ceremonies or when venturing outside the cloister, though Cistercian nuns were often strictly enclosed, a large black wool mantle or cloak might have been worn over the entire habit. This mantle provided additional warmth and a more formal, solemn appearance. The materials were chosen for their robustness and availability. Wool, a staple of medieval textile production, was spun and woven, often within the monastery itself, by the nuns or lay sisters. The natural colors of the wool meant less processing and no expensive dyes, aligning with their vow of poverty. The Cistercian habit was designed for a life dedicated to prayer, manual labor, and strict enclosure. Practicality of the unbleached wool meant that the habit was durable and well-suited for the demanding physical work that was part of the Cistercian charism, such as farming, gardening, or other monastic industries like weaving. The simplicity of the cut allowed for ease of movement during their demanding liturgical schedule, which included hours spent chanting the divine office in choir. The uniform, unadorned nature of the habit removed any individual distinctions, fostering a strong sense of community and shared purpose. The black veil, contrasting with the lighter main habit, also helped to reinforce their separation from the secular world and their commitment to a life consecrated to God. Cistercian nunneries spread across Europe, often associated with existing male foundations or established by noble families. Examples include the Abbey of Maubuisson in France, founded in 1236, or the Abbey of Hackenbroich in Germany. Records from these foundations detail the daily life and the consistent wearing of the Cistercian habit. The Exordium Parvum, Little Beginning, a foundational document of the Cistercian order, emphasizes the return to the strict observance of the Benedictine rule, including simplicity in dress. Chroniclers like William of Malmesbury, though writing about the male Cistercians, noted their dedication to austerity and plainness in all aspects of their lives, including their clothing. The Cistercian habit, in its deliberate simplicity and natural colors, stood as a testament to an order that prized humility, hard work, and an unswerving dedication to a reformed monastic ideal, a silent sermon in cloth and wool. Number 8. The Augustinian Black. The Augustinian order, formerly known as the Order of St. Augustine, drew its inspiration from the rule of St. Augustine of Hippo, a foundational text for many religious communities since the 5th century. While not founded by a single individual like Benedictines or Franciscans, various communities of canons and canonesses adopted Augustine's rule, which emphasizes community, charity, and common life. For Augustinian nuns, their habit typically featured a black color, symbolizing penance and solemnity, and was designed to be simple and functional, reflecting their commitment to prayer and service within the cloister, often with an emphasis on intellectual pursuits or charitable work. The primary components of the Augustinian habit included a long black wool tunic. This tunic extended from the neck to the feet, usually with long sleeves that reached the wrists. The black color was standard for many older religious orders, signifying a rejection of worldly vanity and a dedication to a life of penance. Over the tunic, the nuns wore a black wool scapular. This was a long, narrow strip of fabric that hung down the front and back of the habit, typically extending below the knees. The scapular had a simple opening for the head and rested flat over the shoulders. Around the waist, a simple leather cincture or belt was worn, often with a rosary attached, its beads typically made of wood or bone. The head covering for Augustinian nuns consisted of a white linen coif that completely covered the hair, and over this, a black veil. This black veil was a simple rectangular piece of fabric that draped over the head and shoulders, providing modesty and uniformity. Sometimes, for ceremonial occasions or during colder weather, a black wool mantle or cloak was worn over the entire habit, offering additional warmth and a more formal appearance. The materials for the Augustinian habit were practical and durable. Black wool, dyed using natural substances like oak galls or certain barks, was chosen for its warmth and its traditional association with monastic life. Linen, for undergarments and coifs, provided comfort. Nuns often engaged in the making and mending of their own habits, with lay sisters assisting in the processing of raw materials. The general uniformity of the habit across various Augustinian foundations underscored their shared adherence to the rule of St. Augustine. The Augustinian habit facilitated a daily life of structured prayer, communal living, and various forms of service, which might include running schools, caring for the sick, or transcribing manuscripts. The long tunic and scapular allowed for ease of movement during the numerous daily services in choir, where nuns would stand, kneel, and bow. The black color conveyed a sense of seriousness and dedication. The habit, being relatively simple in cut, was practical for manual labor within the monastery, such as gardening, cooking, or maintaining the cloister. It provided a consistent uniform that minimized individual differences and reinforced their collective identity as women consecrated to God under the Augustinian rule. Constant wearing of the habit also served as a continuous reminder of their vows and their separation from the secular world. Numerous Augustinian convents flourished throughout the medieval period, from the Abbey of Santa Maria in Pistoia, Italy, to foundations across France, Germany, and England. Records from these monasteries often mention the clothing of the nuns, describing the black habits and their maintenance. The Regula Sancti Augustini itself did not prescribe specific colors or detailed cuts for habits, but it emphasized modesty, simplicity, and poverty. Therefore, the black habit became a common interpretation of these principles, aligning with the visual traditions of other mendicant and monastic orders. Historians like Giles Constable, in his studies of monasticism, note the widespread adoption of the Augustinian rule and the variety of communities that followed it, yet maintained a consistent visual identity through their simple, often black attire. This habit, while lacking elaborate ornamentation, was a powerful symbol of their commitment to a life of common prayer study and charity, a timeless statement of their enduring devotion. Number 9. The Gilbertine, black and white. The Gilbertine order was a unique medieval English order, founded by Saint Gilbert of Sempringham in the mid-12th century. It was the only monastic order of English origin and was distinctive for its practice of having double monasteries, housing both canons and nuns under one roof, though in strictly separate quarters. The habit for Gilbertine nuns was a combination of black and white, reflecting a blend of traditional monastic colors and the specific regulations of their founder, emphasizing simplicity, chastity, and a life dedicated to prayer and charity. Primary components of the Gilbertine nun's habit included a long black wool tunic. This tunic extended from the neck to the feet, with long sleeves that reached the wrists. The black color, common among many older monastic orders, symbolized penance and solemnity. Over the black tunic, the nuns wore a black wool scapular, a long, narrow strip of fabric that hung down the front and back of the habit, typically extending below the knees. The scapular had a simple opening for the head and rested flat over the shoulders. Around the waist, a simple leather cincture or belt was worn, often with a rosary attached. The distinctive feature of the Gilbertine habit, beyond the black base, was the white wool mantle or cloak worn over the black tunic and scapular, especially for liturgical functions or during colder weather. This white mantle was a full-length garment, often with a hood attached, providing warmth and a striking visual contrast. The head covering for Gilbertine nuns consisted of a white linen coif that completely covered the hair, and over this a black veil. This black veil was a simple rectangular piece of fabric that draped over the head and shoulders, providing modesty and uniformity. The black veil set against the white mantle when worn created a distinctive pattern that set the Gilbertines apart from other orders that primarily wore black or white throughout. The materials for the Gilbertine habit were practical and robust, suitable for the climate of England. Black wool for the tunic, scapular, and veil would have been dyed, perhaps using woad or other readily available natural dyes. White wool for the mantle would have been carefully cleaned and possibly sun-bleached to achieve its lighter color. Linen for the coif and undergarments provided comfort against the skin. Like other monastic communities, Gilbertine nuns would have been involved in the making and mending of their own habits with the assistance of lay sisters and possibly local weavers, ensuring that the clothing was durable and fit for purpose. Adhering to their vow of poverty, the Gilbertine habit was essential for a daily life centered on rigorous liturgical prayer, manual labor, and the specific communal dynamics of a double monastery. The black and white habit facilitated movement during the numerous daily services in choir, where nuns chanted the divine office. The white mantle, when worn, provided additional warmth in the frequently cold English monasteries and added a formal dignity to their appearance during communal gatherings. The uniform nature of the habit removed individual distinctions and promoted a strong sense of collective identity within a uniquely structured religious community. The strict enclosure maintained even within a double monastery meant that the habit was primarily seen by other members of the order and the occasional visitors, but its design clearly articulated their religious commitment. Gilbertine monasteries, such as the Mother House at Sempringham in Lincolnshire, and others across England, were significant centers of monastic life in the medieval period. Records from these foundations, including the Rule of St. Gilbert, describe the requirements for the nun's attire, emphasizing modesty, simplicity, and the specific combination of black and white. Historians like Janet Burton, who has studied the Gilbertine order extensively, highlight the distinctive visual identity provided by their habit, which was a clear departure from other orders and a direct reflection of their unique foundation and spirituality. The Gilbertine habit, with its contrasting black and white elements, was a unique statement of English monasticism, a visible embodiment of a distinctive spiritual path that balanced the solitude of monastic life with the communal realities of a double monastery. It spoke volumes about their commitment to a specific way of life, a visual testament to their unique place in medieval religious history. Number 10. The Benedictine Black. The Benedictine order, one of the oldest and most influential monastic orders in the Western Church, traces its origins back to Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century. His Rule for Monasteries provided a comprehensive guide for communal monastic life, emphasizing stability, obedience, humility, and the Opus Dei or divine work, referring to the daily round of liturgical prayer. For Benedictine nuns, their habit was a timeless symbol of their dedication to this ancient tradition, universally recognized by its predominant black color, signifying solemnity, humility, and a renunciation of the world. The foundational elements of the Benedictine habit included a long black wool tunic. This tunic extended from the neck to the feet, typically with long, relatively loose sleeves that reached the wrists. The black color was chosen early on for its practicality, solemnity, and association with a penitential life. Over the tunic, the nuns wore a black wool scapular, a long, narrow strip of fabric that hung down the front and back of the habit, usually extending below the knees. The scapular had a simple opening for the head and rested flat over the shoulders. Around the waist, a simple leather cincture or belt was worn, often with a rosary attached, its beads typically made of wood or bone. The head covering for Benedictine nuns consisted of a white linen coif that completely covered the hair, and over this, a black veil. This black veil was a simple rectangular piece of fabric that draped over the head and shoulders, providing modesty and uniformity. For ceremonial occasions or during colder weather, a long black wool mantle or cloak was worn over the entire habit, offering additional warmth and a more formal appearance. The materials for the Benedictine habit were typically wool for the main garments, and linen for the undergarments and head coverings. The black wool would have been dyed using natural pigments like woad or various barks and iron salts, ensuring a deep and lasting color. Nuns often engaged in the preparation of these materials themselves, from spinning yarn to weaving cloth and sewing their habits, a testament to their self-sufficiency and dedication to manual labor prescribed by the rule. The Benedictine habit was intrinsically woven into the daily life of prayer, work, and study within the cloister. The long, voluminous black tunic allowed for comfortable movement during the many hours spent in choir chanting the divine office. The black color, while visually uniform, was also practical for everyday use and less prone to showing dirt. The layers of the habit provided warmth in often unheated monastic buildings. The head covering, with the white coif and black veil, ensured complete modesty and uniformity, removing individual distinctions and fostering a sense of shared identity and purpose. The habit served as a constant external reminder of their vows of stability, obedience, and conversion of manners, guiding their actions throughout the day, whether in the scriptorium, the infirmary, or the gardens. Benedictine nunneries were ubiquitous throughout medieval Europe, from the earliest foundations, like the Abbey of Sainte Radegonde in Poitiers, France, dating to the 6th century, to the grand and influential Abbey of Fontefroid, a double monastery founded in the 12th century. Records from these extensive foundations, including the Regula Benedicti itself, prescribe a habit that is simple and inexpensive, and suitable for the climate of the place. The black color became the standard interpretation of these principles. Chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis, writing in the 12th century, frequently describe Benedictine nuns and their commitment to their monastic observances, always depicted in their distinctive black habits. The Benedictine habit, simple yet profound, was not merely clothing. It was a visible symbol of centuries of uninterrupted prayer, scholarship, and community life, an enduring testament to a spiritual path that profoundly shaped the course of Western civilization.